In this video, we will talk about the context of the Gospel of Matthew. Like the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew is traditionally believed to be written by the person whose name is on the text, which is Matthew in this case. Now, there are a couple different reasons for this. Like the Gospel of Mark, most scholars think that the authorship of this text is anonymous. We're unsure who actually wrote it, because some of the reasons that people have suggested Matthew in the past do not really hold up with the clues we see inside the text. One of the reasons Matthew's name was probably put on this text is because from the Gospel of Mark, Levi is the tax collector. But when we come to the Gospel of Matthew, this name is replaced with Matthew. Some people think that this would be an indication that the author wrote himself into the text. But besides this idea, we do not have any evidence that this is the case. There also could have been some confusion with Greek names. The name Matthios, which is translated to Matthew in English, looks very similar to the Greek for mathetes, which is disciple or learner in Greek. Some of this confusion might have led to Matthew, his name being put on this text, but most scholars will argue that this is anonymously authored. Like the dating of the Gospel of Mark, we have a relatively broad time range when this Gospel was written. It was definitely written after the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, but it could have been written up to about 110 CE. Most scholars will date it sometime in the 80s because early church historians and writers began to reference the Gospel of Matthew sometime in the 80s and 90s, which would indicate that this text was written before this point and was relatively widespread and had an audience. So let us talk about the audience of the Gospel of Matthew just a bit. The Gospel was more than likely written in Syria, and particularly in or around the city of Antioch. Now, some of the reasons for this is because Ignatius of Syria was especially well read in the Gospel of Matthew, which would indicate that the Gospel of Matthew was being passed around his area, which was Syria. Additionally, there was a major diaspora community in the area of Antioch. Now, Jewish diaspora community was a community who had been pushed out of their homeland of Jerusalem after the destruction of Jerusalem and sought refuge somewhere else. So there's this major community in Antioch, and the Gospel of Matthew is particularly concerned with people who have been expelled from their homeland. Additionally, the Gospel of Matthew focuses on the disciple Peter, who was at this time preaching in the Antioch during the time of Jesus. Finally, Matthew specifically indicates Jesus' fame being spread, quote, throughout all Syria, end quote. He specifically notes this region in 4:24. So there are several indicators that whomever wrote Matthew was writing in or around Syria, specifically the city of Antioch. The Gospel of Matthew was more than likely written to a Jewish Christian audience. Some of the reasons that we can see this is because the Gospel of Matthew is primarily concerned with the Hebrew Bible law, or Torah, and interpreting that, and how Jesus fulfills that. So as we will look through the Gospel of Matthew, we'll notice some of these themes that are particularly pertaining to Judaism, rather than being a Greek or Roman. The Gospel of Matthew has a few intentions in terms of authorship. First, the Gospel of Matthew seems to be intended to express the identity not only of Jesus Christ, but also of his disciples. The author wants his audience to know that Jesus is the Son of God and is the fulfillment of Hebrew Bible prophecy, and that this prophecy is not only something spread to Jews, but also to Gentiles and available for all. The author is also concerned with negating false teachings that are being spread throughout the church. One of these major issues is the disciples stealing the body of Christ after the crucifixion, which is a teaching being spread around. We'll talk about that here in a moment when we get to the distinctive elements in this text. Finally, as I mentioned a little bit before, the Gospel of Matthew is especially concerned with expressing how Jesus fulfills the law in the Hebrew Bible. There are a few themes that we see throughout the text of the Gospel of Matthew. The first of these, like we see in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll see in Luke as well, is that Jesus is the Son of God. Again, we see this theme of Jesus fulfilling and being the primary interpreter of the Hebrew Bible and the law. One of the ways that the Gospel of Matthew connects the Hebrew Bible and Jesus is in the very first verse by giving a genealogy of Jesus, who's called the Messiah or Anointed One, and connecting him with David, Abraham, who are major figures in the Hebrew Bible. This not only links Jesus as somebody who's inheriting this Israelite tradition, but also links the texts of the Hebrew Bible and this new gospel. Jesus is also called Emmanuel in this text. Emmanuel literally means God with us. In the text of Isaiah, which we see in the Hebrew Bible, we find a verse that says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel." Now this verse, in the context of Isaiah, seems to be talking about Isaiah's child, or perhaps King Ahaz's child, who Isaiah was writing about at this point. Matthew, however, interprets this verse to be about Jesus as the fulfillment of a supposed prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. Finally, we see the theme of discipleship being obedience. For Matthew, instead of discipleship being suffering, like we see in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew's focused on showing that disciples should be obedient to the law that Jesus teaches, and that this discipleship is expressed through love for others. There are a few distinguishing features to note that are specific to the Gospel of Matthew and not found in the other Gospels. The first of these is the Sermon on the Mount that contains the Beatitudes. While we do see a Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke, the actual Sermon on the Mount is specific to Matthew. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we see the tomb guards towards the end of the Gospel. Matthew says, "The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days I will rise again. Therefore command the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may go and steal him away, and tell the people he has been raised from the dead, and the last deception will be worse than the first.'" It's important to note that the Gospel of Matthew specifically explains here, as well as later in the Gospel, that there were guards at the tomb of Jesus to make sure that the disciples could not steal his body. This is because whomever wrote Matthew was focused on negating this false teaching that the disciples stole the body of Christ in an effort to show that he was raised from the dead. Matthew takes efforts in several different places to show that this could not have been the case because there were guards at the tomb. We also see the commission in the Gospel of Matthew, which is specific to this text. The commission is Jesus telling his disciples to go out and make disciples of everyone else. So discipleship here, again, is the idea of obedience to Jesus' teachings and to love one another. Some minor things that we see, but you probably are familiar with, are King Herod and the journey to Egypt during Jesus' birth, when Herod was trying to kill infant children, and Mary and Joseph had to run away to Egypt to prevent being killed, which is where Jesus ended up being born on these travels. And we also see the wise men, specifically in the Gospel of Matthew, but not in the other Gospels, when it comes to the birth narrative of Jesus. And it's interesting to note here that we don't have 3 wise men, like we typically see in nativity scenes. It does not indicate how many there actually were. Now that we have reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the Gospel of Matthew, describe the historical setting and context of the Gospel of Matthew, identify the themes and distinguishing features in the Gospel of Matthew, and give examples of how they are used in the text.